Can there be a political solution to a brutal massacre? Let's check some receipts. In 1929, over a week of riots broke out, starting in Jerusalem and spreading into other areas of British Mandate Palestine. The impact of this outbreak was such that historian Hillel Cohen has deemed 1929 as year zero of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Unfortunately, not only did these riots share features with the Hamas attacks against Israel on October 7th, they also similarly inflamed divisions, fears, and hatreds among the Palestinian, Arab, and Jewish populations in ways that influenced political and social structures in the region. So I need to set the scene for 1929. While the predominantly Arab territories of the former Ottoman Empire had hoped to win an independent Arab state after World War I, Britain and France split these territories into several countries to be administered into what were called mandate governments. They were essentially colonies of Britain and France, but intended to become independent at some indefinite future point. Palestine was unique among these mandates because it was also designated by the British as a recognized area for the creation of a Jewish national home, sought by the Zionist or Jewish nationalist movement. The British considered creating a representative assembly of all the residents of Mandate Palestine, like a parliament, but for a variety of reasons, this did not materialize. Instead, the territory was ruled through British administrators and dealt with the Jewish and Arab residents separately, including by creating a supreme Muslim council to do things like manage family law and religious properties, and the British worked with the National Committee formed by the Zionist organization. So, when riots broke out in 1929, Mandate Palestine was a patchwork of political and religious governing entities. The British Mandate Administration, Zionist organizations, the Old Yishuv, a term referring to Jewish communities that had lived in the region for generations and were, in most cases, actually opposed to Zionist influences, and Arab communities increasingly relying upon their religious leaders as intermediaries with the British administration. Through the mid-1920s, Arabs and Jews had disputed the kinds of access that Jews could have to a historic Jewish holy site, the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall, where Jews prayed and still prayed, being the closest remaining ruins of the walls surrounding the ancient temple, which was destroyed by the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE. Where the temple stood has, since the 7th century CE, been the Islamic holy site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Disputes about the Wailing Wall ended up becoming a proxy for competing Jewish and Arab nationalist movements, and this is evident in part from the fact that it was not the Jews who prayed at the wall who were campaigning for different types of control at the wall, but instead key Zionists like Joseph Klausner and his Wailing Wall Committee, the newspaper Doar Hayom, and the right-wing Zionist youth group Beitar. But the religious nature of the proxy also added a particularly religious charge to these competing nationalist movements. Fears about how Jews or Muslim Arabs wanted to control or limit the wall created an environment where nationalist marches and eventually something as minor as a soccer ball kicked onto someone's property sparked an outbreak of violence in 1929. This escalated into full-blown massacres, the worst of which were carried out by Palestinian Arabs against pious Jewish communities unaffiliated with the Zionist nationalist movement. The London Times reported on the carnage from the city of Hebron, where men, women, and children were massacred and injured by hand, and in some cases using weapons raided from a local police station. Hospitals and synagogues and homes were attacked. Hundreds were evacuated and displaced. Much like in Israel in October, there was a severe delay in government response to defend these communities against the rioting. If the weapons and technology that the Hamas militants used on October 7th were available to the mobs that went through Hebron and Tzfat in 1929, there would likely be very similar scenes as the horrors we saw on October 7th. There were also many instances of Jewish retaliation against Arabs in the midst of the violence, and in the end, there were many casualties in both communities. The British sent a 2-month-long commission of inquiry to interview dozens of witnesses, examine the sites of the violence, and try to figure out what exactly happened. Their stated goal was to make recommendations as to the steps necessary to avoid recurrence. The report concluded that despite the religious rhetoric and emotions surrounding the outbreak of violence, that the riots were a result of political and economic conditions. The report concluded that, quote, it is necessary to consider how far disappointment and resentment among the Arab population consequent upon their failure to obtain a measure of self-government may have been a cause which contributed to the outbreak in August last, or is likely to be a cause of disturbance in the future. In another part of the report, they conclude, quote, it appears to us obvious that the Arab attitude, the result of a dangerous combination of anger and fear, is potential cause of future disturbance. Even though the Shaw Commission identified political roots under the religiously charged riots, the unspeakable violence and horror of the riots prevented acceptance of political solutions. The High Commissioner of Palestine at the time justifiably labeled the 1929 riots as atrocious acts committed by bodies of ruthless and bloodthirsty evildoers. In light of the cartoonishly evil nature of the attacks, considering possible political or economic causes appeared to justify what had been labeled simply bloodthirst. So while the results of the report suggested the lack of a representative body or constitution was one of the root causes for the outbreak of violence, the British government used the outbreak of violence as a reason to delay the creation of a representative body. The High Commissioner declared that even though he had entered into discussions with the British Secretary of State while he was in England on the subject of constitutional changes in Palestine months prior, in view of recent events, I shall suspend these discussions with His Majesty's government. For much of the Zionist leadership, and even for some non-Zionist Jewish groups in Palestine, the lesson from the riots appeared to be the need for a more concerted effort to develop Jewish self-defense in Palestine, despite British limitations against this. Making matters worse, many Arab Palestinians actually celebrated the 1929 riots. When 3 Arabs were given the death penalty for their crimes during the riots, a commemorative event was held 40 days after their death, where these rioters were hailed as, quote, forerunners of freedom and independence who met the Lord peacefully without fear and grief. The Palestinian-Arab politician Emil al-Ghuri, even 4 years later, reflected that, quote, that day of the riots was a day of brilliance and glory in the annals of Palestinian-Arab history. This is a day of honor, splendor, and sacrifice. We attacked Western conquest and the mandate and the Zionists upon our land. In our silence, they had seen a sign of weakness. Therefore, there was no more room in our hearts for patience or peace. The receipts of the 1929 riots and the Shaw Commission could maybe serve as a warning. Who knows where we might be if that representative body that the commission report recommended had come into being in the 1920s. I condemn any act of violence, and I certainly condemn any celebration of violence, but I think there are enough receipts to indicate that sometimes even the worst violence might need political, not military, solutions.